Mr. President, I want to talk about what's happening to our environment in South Florida as a result of sea level rise. Now, we can put this in the political terms of climate change, but that seems to be an issue that some want to deny. So I want to talk about what you can't deny, and that is that the sea is rising, particularly as shown in South Florida. Mr. President, I brought the Commerce Committee a year and a half ago to Miami Beach and brought a whole series of witnesses, one of which was a NASA scientist who testified that measurements, now this is not forecast, this is not projections, this is measurements of the level of the sea over the course of the last 4 decades, that the sea has risen in South Florida between 5 and 8 inches. And the reason I am bringing this to the attention of the Senate today is I just returned from Miami, where the latter part of September, the first part of October, is the seasonal high tides, and the streets of Miami Beach are flooded. As a matter of fact, 2 years ago, the mayor of Miami Beach, when he was campaigning for that position, did a campaign commercial in a kayak on Alton Road, which is on the westerly side of the barrier island, away from the ocean, and it was flooded. And in the intervening 2 years, the city of Miami Beach, in cooperation with the local governments of all of the Southeast Florida governments, have spent millions of dollars on big pumps so that when the tides come, they can get the water out of the streets. And a year ago, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and I went down there at this time of year on the seasonal high tide, and lo and behold, the pumps worked, and the pumps got the water back into Biscayne Bay so that the roads stayed dry. But look what happened 2 days ago. This is downtown Miami Beach. You see the fella? It's above his ankles, and he's up on the curb. Right here is the curb. He steps down and it comes up just below his knee. You see the cars, you see the water. That's downtown Miami Beach. This is not just the phenomenon of the big full moon. This is the phenomenon of sea level rise. Let's take another view. Okay, here's a lady that is trying to keep her feet dry up on a wall, and you can see that here is the sidewalk, here's the curb, there's the street, and as you can see, this is a middle part of the barrier island of Miami Beach. This isn't right next to the beach. It isn't right next to Biscayne Bay. On either side, the east and the west of the barrier island, this is in the middle, where you have all of these, in this case, it's condominiums where people live. So what is causing this? Mr. President, what is causing it is that planet Earth is heating up. The measurements are there. Now, why is it heating up? It's simply this, that as the sun's rays come in and hit the earth, they reflect off of the earth, and that heat radiates back out into space. It's the same principle, for example, on the space shuttle. When I participated in the space program 30 years ago, when we were on orbit in the early part of the space shuttle program on the Space Shuttle Columbia, once we get on orbit, we open those payload bay doors, and they serve as radiators of all the heat that is generated on board the spacecraft. We radiate it back out into space so that the spacecraft does not overheat. So too, planet Earth, the natural phenomena is that the sun's rays hit the earth, reflect back out, some of the heat is retained, but most of that heat is radiated back out into space until you start to create the effect of a ceiling high in the atmosphere of the greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, and those gases start to create a ceiling effect so that as the heat is radiating back towards space, it's trapped. And therefore, the whole planet starts to heat up. And what is most of the earth covered with? The oceans. That's where most of that additional heat is absorbed. 90% of the heat that is trapped in the Earth's greenhouse effect is absorbed into the oceans of the planet. And as a result, when water is heated, water expands. And thus, one of the phenomena of seeing the seas begin to rise. Now, the melting of the glaciers, the melting of the polar ice caps, adding more instead of frozen glaciers, that's going into the sea, displacing water, and those glaciers are melting. That adds to it as well. But it is the trapping of the heat that is causing this phenomenon. Now, we have made projections as to what the heat is that we're trapping. But now we have an instrument out in space that can precisely measure. Because there is a spacecraft that was launched earlier this year, Discover. It has several instruments on it. One of the instruments, by the way, you can go to the NASA website and you can see real time, every hour and a half, another picture of the entire Earth on the daylight side of the Earth, because the spacecraft is placed 1 million miles from planet Earth between the Earth and the sun. So the spacecraft looking back at Earth is always looking at the daylight side of the Earth as it revolves about its axis 365 days a year as it revolves around the sun. That's one instrument. But there's another instrument, and that is the instrument that measures the amount of the sun's heat that goes into the earth and the amount of the heat that is radiated back out. And if you subtract the amount radiated back out into space from that amount of heat that goes into the earth, you subtract the two, and you get a precise measurement of how much of the heat sent by the sun is trapped in the Earth's atmosphere. Now we have a precise instrument that will tell us exactly what that is instead of the scientific projections that we have used, and that's as a result of this new satellite spacecraft that we just put up earlier this year called Discover. So, Mr. President, we can't keep denying what in fact is happening. And the proof's in the pudding. And the proof is right here. There's no other way that you can explain in a seasonal high tide, which for the last 2 centuries, this barrier island has basically been dry during the seasonal high tide. But now we're seeing this. Now, the consequences of this are really quite severe. First of all, 75% of Florida's population is along the coast. Florida is now the 3rd largest state. We've surpassed New York. We have 20 million people now. 75% of that population is along the coast. And so as the sea level rises and people have to start dealing with this, what do you think is going to happen to the value of their property? What about their fresh water? Florida sits on a honeycomb of limestone that is filled with fresh water. Salt water is heavier than fresh water. So as the sea level rises, it starts to penetrate that honeycomb of fresh water. That is the substructure of the peninsula of Florida. And that then causes saltwater intrusion into our drinking water, into the water that we have to use to sustain life. There are no good results as a result of this consequence of sea level rise. So, Mr. President, I once again bring up to the Senate, we have some who say this is not something that's real. In fact, here's the proof. Proof's in the pudding, and there's something we can do about it. And what we can do about it is start adopting policies that will put less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that means that we have to be diligent in making sure that we enact policies to do it. Now, there are several different ways that you could do that. One, of course, is the regulatory way, which is going on right now, which a lot of our colleagues don't like. You regulate smokestacks, you regulate the amount of pollutants that you can put out and so forth. There's another way, and that is to use the private marketplace of supply and demand by putting a price or a fee on the use of carbon, and therefore the market will dictate whether or not a person puts more CO2 as a result of burning carbon into the air. And that will drive the marketplace to find alternative fuels that in fact are a lot cleaner, so that we can show the rest of the world what we're going to have to do. I think it was rather prophetic that the Pope just last week continuously talked about climate change in all of his speeches. I think it was also prophetic that the Chinese president, in his visit to the United States, apparently they are so choked because of the pollutants in the air in major cities in China, that they're finally coming to the altar, so to speak, to realize that they've got to do something about it. Otherwise, they're threatening the complete health of their people in China. With this newfound attention to this problem, let's go do something about it by building bipartisan support for a solution. That's the right thing to do. And it's just another reminder that what's happening in Miami Beach right now is what is the wave of the future unless we change our policies.